Hi, Greg.
Good evening, Hugh.
It's Sunday, the 21st of July. This is our full moon video.
It's that time of the month, and your topic today, I think, might interest some people. The real life account of how you were tortured as a young person after you were kidnapped by Osborne and Hall and Wallace and Long and Andrews and Anderson. And I don't want to say too much about it because I think we're just going to make it a somewhat of a shorter video tonight so more people will listen. And I think you got all the details here tonight for us. So I'm just going to hand it over to you and listen to what you have to say about it.
The moon's in Capricorn. I'm in two of your books now. I
Yeah.
like, I like the chapter in this book better than this book.
Oh, no way. I think I improved it.
I don't. And then here I am. This is Kennedy's press secretary stealing my trademark with two of my neighbors, Bailey and Nagy.
Yeah, I have that. Yeah.
Then
Yeah.
I made my first album at Spirit Airlines, Sea Spirit.
Yes.
That was my first album in the 60s with my trademark Bottomline. And then I like this time cover. See, it says, why the economy is trumping race. And they got a picture of Obama, who was president.
Uh-huh.
In Obama's White House, Garrett murdered two of my wives and my attorney as they destroyed my business via CBS. Walters was my wife's advocate, and her phone was used to scream the attorney general's name at me in Tennessee as they cut my wife's ears off and slit her throat Halloween Eve. And see, this is why the economy is trumping race. And this magazine was put out in 2006, I believe. Yeah, 2006. And Trump wasn't even running to be president, but they're using his name, already setting it up in this propaganda.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah,
they know exactly what they're doing way ahead of time.
yeah, these corporations, they do this. They run the country and they hide news. Like my whole family's been murdered 5 times on holidays, and there's never any news in the news about dismembered, raped, murdered women on holidays. No news, not even obituaries on any of my 4 wives. 2 were fiancés. We were about to be married that week, and 2 were wives.
Because that same media that knows who's going to be president is creating the entire narrative for the entire country.
In 1957, well, I want to show one more picture here.
Sure.
This is my family, Marilyn Monroe. Can you see her?
Yes, Mrs. Norma Jean Baker there, Miss Norma Jean Baker. Yep.
And I'm the Baker family.
Mm-hmm.
And she's being hired by Hoover to spy on John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy. And she was actually having sex with both of them, spying on them.
Mm-hmm.
And then she actually called Jackie Kennedy and told her she was going to steal her husband from her. And this is Hoover paying my family member, Marilyn Monroe, to spy on the president. And the president was Irish like me, Catholic like me, and I was being raised to be a Catholic priest at that time. And Hoover had a boyfriend who was gay, Tolson Anderson. And
Yep.
Anderson, Andrews, Long, Osborne, Darrell Hall, and Wallace kidnapped me on the day my uncle, Admiral Byrd, was murdered. And I don't know if I can get to that picture from here.
You mean the Admiral Byrd that all the conspiracy people are always saying found a hole to the center of the earth and all that baloney?
Those diaries weren't written in his handwriting, and he didn't write it.
Right.
My mother was his Navy nurse, and she told me all my life that he was murdered.
Mm-hmm.
And he was murdered when he confronted Truman and Eisenhower about selling guns and getting drugs in return and putting them on the streets of America, like Noriega was doing with the Senate in my lifetime. And can you see this note? It's to Victoria's family.
Yeah.
I visit this afternoon to offer my support and care. Please know you are in my thoughts and prayers. Peace. Byrd. And then here's a picture of Admiral Byrd underneath it.
Mm-hmm.
And Admiral Byrd didn't write the diaries about the UFOs and aliens.
Right.
And then when Kennedy was killed, Jackie ran to Greece to Onassis, and the guy that runs the History Channel now is Giorgio Tsoukalos. And they hide my truth of Kennedy's murder behind UFOs and aliens all day long.
Right.
And you keep telling me to make shorter videos, but all of America watches 5 hours of the History Channel, which is complete BS.
Yeah, you're right. It's just they don't care about reality. They want the I don't know. They prefer the lies and the entertainment value over the reality and the truth.
Yeah, well, I'm the real truth of history. You know that.
Yeah.
You've seen all my documents. And my wife, this Victoria Byrd, visited her after I found her murdered and revived her with CPR. And bikers and police were hired to murder her. They used fake names and badge numbers. I found her murdered early in the morning, gave her CPR, revived her, took her to this hospital in Johnson City. And they murdered her a second time. They sodomized her while she was unconscious. They took her ears off and they slit her throat Halloween Eve. They tortured her for 35 days. Gay nurses. She had 3 gay nurses that did this to her. And somebody spent millions of dollars to hire hitmen, pay off a coroner to the coroner in her case wrote natural causes on a dismembered body. And then they cremated her without my permission 4 hours after her throat was slit.
Yeah.
Because they didn't want anybody to know her ears were missing. And then the police, where I found her murdered in Greenville, Tennessee, didn't file murder reports. And the sheriff actually told me it's not my fault the federal government is corrupt. And then in Johnson City, the sheriff there he was taking extortion payments to hide rapes in Johnson City at the time. And that's in the news now, and there's a federal court case against them. They stole my trademark BL, Bottomline Music, and it was a publishing company in New York. And they put BLM all over with the Bundys as they murdered my 4th wife, Nancy Lavoie. Her leg was removed and she was murdered as they shot Lavoie Finicum. And you know, the FBI did that. And
And for those who don't know, he was notorious as being part of that BLM.
Yeah. Her advocate, Walters, Mrs. Walters' phone was used to scream slatery at me as they cut her ears off as torture in Johnson City Hospital.
Yeah, right there while she's laying in the hospital bed, they did this.
Yeah, and screamed at me slatery, and Slatery was Attorney General of Tennessee. And they murdered my attorney on the same day they murdered Victoria. They murdered him the next day.
Yeah.
I had hired him to file murder reports, so there was never a murder report made out. And the sheriff in one town said it's not his fault, the federal government's corrupt. And the other sheriff said he was going to leave the murder up to God. 2 murders. I have no faith in the police in Tennessee anymore. They were using fake badge numbers, and the outlaws had built a clubhouse down the street from my farmhouse. It was a Civil War ranch that Stubblefield and Manning set me up on. And they murdered 3 of my wives while I lived on it. And then Major Tom Garrett in Obama's White House office, his journalist, destroyed my income as they murdered Victoria and my lawyer, so I couldn't hire another lawyer. And he destroyed my income with lies. I had an online computer business, and he completely destroyed it lying. And then CBS, which when I was a kid was the Canadian Broadcasting System. So once again, it comes from London. Put him on the takeout and gave him a raise as my lawyer and wife were murdered. And he destroyed my income from Obama's White House. And these things are not coincidence. When I moved to California, Garrett's name is written in my mailbox, along with another rapist who was raping little girls in California. And none of this is coincidence. So, remind me, we were going to talk about when Osborne kidnapped me. Chained me to a toilet in his basement with Darrell Hall, Anderson, Andrew, Wallace, and Long handed me to Osborne. And he was beating me up with a 2x4 on my thighs. And in today's news, they were making fun of this with Peter Thiel. And then when I said this truth, they removed Peter Thiel from the news. But he was beating my thighs with a 2x4 and punching me for gay sex. Osborne's a man.
Yeah, you were 4 years old. You're talking in 1957.
Yeah, on the day they murdered Admiral Byrd.
Right.
And they told you he died of a heart attack or something, and complete lies.
Right.
My mother was his nurse in the Navy. And you can see the date on this letter is 10/20/11. Oh, it's Halloween. 8 days later on Halloween, they murdered her.
Yeah, 10 days, yeah.
They slit her throat.
Right.
In Tennessee, it was the 28th. They celebrated it for the kids on a Friday or a Thursday.
Gotcha.
So Osborne had me chained to a toilet, and 5 grown men beat my twin to death. And L. Brooks Patterson was sitting out in the driveway in Oakland County, Michigan. And he knew my twin had been murdered, and they threw my twin's body in Pennsylvania. And that's where Daryl Hall got on TV. And Daryl Hall was sitting in a corner watching me and my twin get raped. And he was giving himself oral sex. He was double jointed.
Yeah, TV's Daryl Hall, the very one you see on TV with Oates.
Well, same name. I don't know if it's the same guy.
Okay.
My twin's murdered body was thrown in a Pennsylvania field. And my wife was from Pennsylvania when she was born there. And her father was in the Navy with Kennedy and
Yes.
lived in Pennsylvania. And then he moved his family to Michigan.
And your baby pictures look just like that boy in the box that was supposedly found in the field there in Pennsylvania. And that had to have been him. And the description of how he was
It was
found.
It was him, and somebody used fake DNA and gave you a different name.
Right. Now, I find it amazing, Hugh, that this incident with Trump that just happened, his ear was shot in Pennsylvania, not too far from where all this other stuff happened.
I
I
don't know.
I don't think that's a coincidence at all.
I don't watch the news because I know it's all staged and it's always propaganda.
Yeah. Well,
My uncle Flayton, who put the astronauts on the moon, he told me as he died that his last words to me, he said, "Don't watch the news; it's always propaganda."
that definitely seems to be the case here.
And
You know,
his family put the astronauts on the moon, and Armstrong.
and Victoria was from Pennsylvania, right? And her ear was removed in the hospital, and here he is in Pennsylvania, same state where your brother was twin brother was murdered,
Yeah,
or his body was thrown.
I find his name amusing. It's Thomas Matthew, Matt
Mhm.
Hugh, and I'm Hugh.
Yeah.
Thomas Matthew Crooks, and Victoria's first husband was Thomas, and he broke both her legs and moved her 12-year-old babysitter in and left her on the street in her own house in Harrisville, Michigan, before I met her. And she already had muscular dystrophy, and he broke both her legs. Ran her into a fence on a trike, broke both her legs, and then brought her babysitter home, who was 12 or 13 years old, and left her in the hospital alone. And his name was Thomas, and he was a drug dealer with the sheriff in Harrisville, Michigan. They both went to jail for dealing drugs illegally, the sheriff and Tom. And the sheriff died in prison, and then Tom got out, and he died a year before. And then his babysitter, I was paying her child support because she had muscular dystrophy. And they stole her home. She paid cash for the home when her mother died, Helen. And Tom never worked. All he did was deal drugs with the sheriff in Harrisville. He took out a loan on her house, never paid a payment, lost the house. The bank sold the house to somebody else. I hired Victoria 3 attorneys, one to get her house back, one to get her a divorce, and one to get her kids back, and she won all 3 cases. But the sheriff Tom was dealing drugs with in Harrisville, Michigan, and I'm the Harris family in the Smithsonian. He wouldn't serve the judge's warrant. He wouldn't give Vicky her kids back. The bank had already sold her house, but she got her divorce. So she didn't get her kids back. And then I was paying child support. Tom was dead for 6 years. And the 12-year-old babysitter was collecting the child support I paid for Vicky illegally for 6 years. So I took.
So that's all that to say that that's the name of the shooter reflects all this.
Yeah, Thomas Matthew Crooks. And gee, how old was he? He looks like he's about 16 years old.
20, they said. They said he was 20.
He looks 16 or 15.
Yeah.
I think Trump used fake blood on his ear. And,
That's what I think.
and Mills, was in the kindergarten class Trump was in on 9/11, as Trump had a Freudian slip and said Hugh's structures are collapsing, if you remember.
Yeah.
And Mills tried to pay me a couple $1 million not to keep my publishing license in New York. With Bourne Publishing, they offered me a lot of money not to keep my publishing license prior to 9/11 because they were planning it. And I know this firsthand.
And so this same Doug Hughes that was, or sorry, Doug Mills that was in the kindergarten class on 9/11 with Bush is taking the pictures of Trump, and miracle of miracles manages to catch a bullet in mid-flight in his picture.
Yeah, it's all staged.
Yeah.
And then Trump went from Pennsylvania, where my wife was born and my twin's body was thrown, to Wisconsin, where my second wife was murdered. And her family was General Heath, who protected New York from my family, Washington, in 1776, as we threw King George out of the country. And Mills filmed Bush in the kindergarten class, and Bush blamed my friends in Florida, the Voss family, and he blamed my Christian friend for paying the Muslims to get lessons from the Voss family. The only problem with that, he was Christian, not Muslim. He was 17 years old, and Bush gave him the money to buy the video stores.
Interesting.
And then the Voss family, I used to fly over to golf in Piper Cubs they flew, and they didn't know how to fly jets.
Right.
And my girlfriend in Florida put Bush in the classroom my uncle filmed him in, Mills. I don't believe anything on TV. I think they shot that little kid and threw him on the roof before Trump splashed actor blood on his ear, because his ear ain't missing. And then I already know they murdered 4 of my wives, and they murdered my mother's whole family at church on Christmas Day. And my mother's family built Hollywood after building the USA.
Yeah. Well, they certainly know how to do it, but see, somehow or another, they also had that 20-year-old shooter there, walking and moving up there too. So they didn't just show him dead. I don't know if they pre-filmed it or they fabricated the whole thing. I don't know how they did it.
It didn't have to be him. It could have been anybody walking up there.
Yeah.
I don't believe anything they put out on the news, and especially in an election year.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then
For sure.
Kamala Harris is not my family. Her own father wrote a book and said that her family were slave traders in Africa
Yeah.
for the kings of Europe.
Bringing families to, or bringing slaves to Jamaica.
Yeah, her own father wrote the book at a college. He's a professor, and she's
Yeah.
not my family. My family's DNA is 100% European. And because of Admiral Byrd being my family, I'm related to all the kings of Europe. They're my cousins.
Right.
Even King James, who authored the Bible, is my cousin. And the Queen was my cousin. And that's a whole nother story. But Osborne, when he kidnapped me, they brought my twin back from California, who was with the Sirhan family. So I ended up in kindergarten with my twin I hadn't seen in 2 years, and Kamala Sirhan, who married my cousin years later. So Kennedy and Sirhan and Bobby Kennedy, my cousins, they're all related, they're family. And Sirhan didn't murder his own family. All of that was staged. Oswald didn't murder JFK. Hoover and Osborne and Wallace and Long murdered JFK. There was 5 senators who murdered my twin at 4. They beat him to death for sex, and they were all gays. Kennedy wanted to get rid of the FBI, not the CIA. Kennedy was Navy. The Navy funds and runs the CIA. And the FBI lied and said he wanted to get rid of the CIA, and he didn't want to get rid of the CIA. He wanted to get rid of Hoover. And Hoover had a gay boyfriend back then. What was his name? Anderson.
Clyde Anderson Tolson. Yeah.
And my second murdered wife, who created the Head Start program for Ronald Reagan, her last name was Terry Heath Olson.
Yeah.
Actually, Terry Ann Olson. She had married the Olson family, and she divorced him because he was gay.
Wow.
And, she was about to marry me, and then the policeman who kidnapped her out of her CPS and Head Start office in Menominee, Wisconsin, she was protecting little kids on the Great Lakes from the porno industry in California, just like they were doing to me and my twin in 57. They would put us on seaplanes and try to fly us to gay bars and sell us for sex to men.
Mm-hmm.
And they were still doing this in 2003. And Terry was protecting a 3-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl from that porno industry in California.
Wow.
On the Great Lakes, the same lakes they were flying me and my brothers off of.
Right.
And that was Osborne doing that. And Osborne was Oswald's bunkmate. I've known all my life Oswald didn't kill Kennedy. Osborne did.
Right. And so that's why the FBI Sex Crimes Division today still has Osborne running it.
Yeah, they're hiding the truth of Kennedy's murder.
Yeah. And their entire industry that apparently must still be going on.
Yeah, they still make porno movies in Van Nuys, California.
Yeah.
And they're using the kids, the FBI. And then we go to John F. Kennedy's murder. On the day John F. Kennedy was murdered, a man who called himself Dr. Stone was running a hospital in Warren, Michigan. And he tortured me by cutting the bone out of my foot as Kennedy was murdered. And then a few days later, I was put in a kindergarten class with Shipley, and her boyfriend was Clint Walker. And
the actor, yeah.
And she would always put me under her desk minus her panties and have me look at her private parts all day long in 6th grade. And she wanted me to stay after class and meet Mr. Walker. And she kept me under her desk all day, kept me past school getting out, and introduced me to Clint Walker as Oswald was walked into Detective Walker and Ruby shot him. And Ruby is my birthstone. I was born in July, and it's not Jack Ruby's name.
Right.
And then Kennedy ran to Onassis after the Duncan kids, my friends, were murdered, and Johnson called my home to take the media off of Kennedy and put it on 5 dead kids. And then the FBI made it required reading in all public schools to read Arsenic and Old Lace by Agatha Christie. And Christie is my aunt, but the real Agatha Christie is Miller. And I bought Miller a house with my publishing company next to on Marion Street, next to the Abrams tank plant. And that's a whole other story. But they said they found Hoffa's blood in Miller's house. And Tony Toko also worked for me. And they tried to blame Tony Toko and Miller for Hoffa's murder as they arrested me for his murder. And they arrested me because my mother-in-law had introduced me to Whitey 5 weeks before Hoffa was murdered. When Hoffa was murdered, my horse disappeared on a state policeman's farm. He already had a hold dog, and he was married to Lou, as you got Hugh Lou from Netflix. And my family made the computers. Joe Jacobs of IBM was my first wife's father, and he gave my cousin Gates the software to make his first computer at Microsoft at my wedding. And he also bought my best man's trademark, Four Seasons, at my wedding. So I've known real history all my life, but I'm unable to say it because Senator Graham owns the media where I and my twin were kidnapped. And Osborne raped us and murdered my twin. And there wasn't one Osborne, there were 3 Osbornes in the house at the time. And it just goes on and on. Mac Osborne was Lee Harvey Oswald's bunkmate in the military. And
Yep.
when I left the house naked, I climbed out a window when somebody knocked on a door. They all ran upstairs. They left me on chain because they had been having anal sex with me on a toilet. And L. Brooks Patterson was in the driveway. And I know him because he's my family. Doris Brooks was my family. And they shook me and told me if I told anyone, they'd murder my parents and my brothers and sisters. So I never told anyone. And then Roseanne Barr and Osborne ran Senator Graham's media. And you know this.
Yeah.
And he owned Channel 4 and WWJ, the 2 biggest TV and radio stations in Oakland County. Senator Graham owned them. And they covered all this up. They covered up the murder of my twin with Anderson from Hoover's lover from the FBI. And the governors that handed me over to Osborne and Darrell Hall. And this has been hidden since 1957. When they murdered my 4 wives, actually when they murdered my 3rd wife, I started telling the truth about Osborne being the Oakland County child killer.
Yeah.
And I went back to L. Brooks Patterson's office to confront him and ask him why he never filed my twin's murder report. And while I was in his office for 2 days, they murdered 5 kids in my family in 2 states on the same day. They murdered my brother-in-law, who ran part of Fort Knox as a DI. They murdered his son. They murdered my bass player's son, 2 Tonys. They murdered my fiance Karen's daughter, Serena. And they murdered 2 Harris girls in Indiana as I sat in his office. And they never gave me an answer. They tried to put me in jail. They had my sister call and ask me to murder her husband, I think. She wanted to go back to Baldwin, who she divorced. She was living with his boss and having Baldwin pay her $2,000 a month in child support. And he was on nuclear subs in the Navy for about 17 years. And a guy named Rusty Hawthorne murdered Brian. He called me on the phone, told me he murdered my brother-in-law, Brian Baldwin. And then he changed his name to Rusty Killen, and he said he's going to come and shoot me in the back of the head next. And he was a truck driver from Louisiana, I believe. And this was before the Hall family handed Alec Baldwin a gun, who hosted Hugh Lou, and I'm Hugh, and Lou was my mother-in-law, who was with Hoffa as he disappeared. And her husband was a ex-state cop who had already dug a hole and stole my horse on the day Hoffa disappeared, and the hole was filled in. And then they tried to kill me. Lou and her husband and my wife tried to kill me 3 times. And at that point, I divorced that family. And that family's still alive. And them and their friends murdered my next 4 wives and children. And I don't think this, I know this. The state policeman would meet with all the bikers on his farm in New Haven, Michigan. And people like Whitey, and they would sell them drugs. His son, Willard, and his wife, my wife, Mary, they were drug dealers, selling bikers drugs on a state policeman's farm in New Haven, Michigan. And I've known all of these things all my life, but if I try to go to the news, they blacklist me. They won't put my truth on the news. And this is because the FBI and the police run the news, and the police murdered my wives, hired as hitmen. And in Tennessee, where they murdered 2 of my wives, actually 3, the FBI put all of them in jail for dealing drugs with bikers. And the bikers they were dealing with built a clubhouse down the street from my home. And I was in the middle of nowhere on a Civil War ranch. My closest neighbor was a half a mile away.
Yeah.
They murdered 2 of my wives there with the police. And I know this for a fact. And then the sheriff in Greenville never filed murder charges on a dismembered body. The other body was hung in her dog's leash, and 30 minutes before she was hung, she told me the police were stalking her again. She told me this 30 minutes before she walked her dog, and then I found her murdered in her dog's leash. And I couldn't say nothing because the police that murdered her were trying to tell me I murdered her. And we were supposed to be married that week. And I had helped her. She called me when she was kidnapped out of her CPS office by police in Menominee, Wisconsin, where Trump just went in Milwaukee after going to Pennsylvania and supposedly being shot. And then he went to Michigan, where my wife and I were from. And Trump, his election committee, Osbourne and Stone, tortured
Amazing, isn't it?
tortured me at 4. Cut the bone out of my foot as they murdered Kennedy. And I've known this all my life. And then my family made Hollywood. So why is he attacking me? They stole the patents for buses, vans, milk trucks, the Fuller transmission from me. They stole my trademark bottom line at the WWF. And gee, Trump fought McMahon,
Yeah.
you know, so all of this fits together perfectly. But no news will put me on the news. Coast to Coast is run by a Turkish man, George Nori. And that's not God's family. The Turkish military men in Israel are not God's family.
Right.
Moses took God's family to the Caucasus Mountains, not to Turkey. And all the rabbis in Israel are Turkish military men. And I know this because I studied the human genome looking for a cure for my wife's muscular dystrophy. And I found one. And Terry had a doctorate and she was going to help me treat people with muscular dystrophy, but they murdered her. So that never happened. I was studying the DNA in the human genome for a long time to find a cure for MD. And then my family went to school with Musk as I grew up on a Indian reservation with Gordon Lightfoot. And then he wrote the Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And then Sharon Collins was my girlfriend all the way back to 5th grade. She asked me to marry her twice, Sharon Collins.
Yeah.
And then Ozzie Osbourne came from London, married to supposedly Sharon Collins. And her real name is Arden. And my church and my high school are on Arden Street.
Wow.
And
Well, he marked that pretty close, didn't he?
yeah, and the FBI funded my school system. And Webster put my trademark bottom line into his dictionary as it was stolen by DuPont. Milky the Clown, who painted the clown at Divco, where my family owned the patents for the milk trucks. DuPont painted them. He painted the buses and the vans too. And Osborne kidnapped me on the day Admiral Byrd was murdered. And none of this is coincidence. And then Stone cut the bone out of my foot as they murdered JFK. And this is Donald Trump's election team.
It's unreal. Yeah, I know.
And then
Wow.
Kamala Harris is pretending she's my family and she's not. My family is 100% European. We're not from Africa or Indonesia.
And it looks like Kelly is going to be her running mate. A senator from, I think, Arizona, if I'm not mistaken.
Kelly was an FBI director also.
And we talked all about that in one of our videos.
Webster was an FBI director.
Right.
And Webster put my stolen trademark into his dictionary after it was stolen for WWF, bottom line events, by Austin, who put Hitler's car in Greenville, Tennessee with Bush. And Bush was making Hitler's uniforms in Greenville, Tennessee and parachutes and selling them cyanide he makes for the U.S. Mints.
So no matter who we talk or whoever, no matter who we vote for, we are going to end up electing people who are not only thieves, but are connected in some way to the child trafficking.
They're all hiding my heritage.
Yeah. And everything they stole.
My only living wife, her cousins, Perry and Cook, who pretend they're George Washington's family.
Yeah.
On their tombstones, they're putting that they're my children's parents, and they're not.
Yeah.
And they're doing this on their tombstones.
Yeah. They're even trying to steal your.
So future generations,
Right.
they're stealing my kids.
Right.
And by doing that, they're stealing my heritage. My great-great-grandfather was President Jackson.
Mhm.
Michael Jackson's mother lived with my cousin, the Queen, for a year, if you remember. I grew up with Michael Jackson's family.
Oh, yeah.
I met Michael Jackson when he was 3 years old at the Michigan State Fair. Then I worked with his cousin, Audley Jackson, driving trucks across country with gasoline refinery products. And Michael Jackson never raped little boys. This is a complete fallacy. As I stopped the illegal gun and drug trade run by Plumlee and Kiki Camarino with the Senate, and it was illegal. They were selling machine guns to Mexican cartels. It was on the farm I bought from Trump's tax attorney, Mazar. And little kids were 3, 4 years old, 6 years old were overdosed on heroin in my driveway because they were selling the Senate drugs on Good Humor trucks. And I called the FBI and I burnt a bunch of drugs in the field with Mr. Giles. And they put me in jail for a year, and they made all the drug dealers movie stars in Hollywood. And I was on the radio and performing all over Chicago, Michigan, Florida, Canada as Bottomline band. And these people, the drug dealers, were selling their drugs wherever I performed. And it was run by the Senate and the CIA, Robert Tosh Plumlee and Kiki Camarino. And they murdered my fiance, Kiki, not related. She was related to Ricky Nelson's family in Missouri. They murdered her Christmas Day, and then they murdered her twin as I sat in L. Brooks Patterson, or her daughter, not her twin. As I sat in L. Brooks Patterson's office a few years later, after my third wife's murder. Kiki's sister was the cover of Maybelline magazine, and my family owned it. And when she was murdered, Mae Musk took over the cover of Maybelline. And these are not coincidences. Somebody with a lot of money hired actors, hitmen, coroners, had her cremated. And they did this to 4 of my wives. Just
Yeah, and who would do that except the government, you
and
know?
they murdered 2 of them twice.
Right.
I found 2 of them murdered, gave them CPR, revived them. I took nurses training because my wife had MD.
Right.
So did both her brothers, and I took care of them for 30 years.
Yeah.
And then look at Michael J. Fox. They make a hero out of Tracy, his wife. But I took care of 3 people with MD for 30 years. And I don't exist as they murder my wife in a wheelchair with MD. You got this picture?
Yeah.
And Michael J. Fox, you got him. His father was in Vietnam with my brother. My brother hit a landmine on a grader and lost the use of his ankles, so he couldn't walk right. And he had special shoes. And he raped Kiki in front of our children just before a murder. And that's when you got Michael J. Fox.
Yeah.
And when I was 3 years old, the guy in the Twilight Zone movie, who was supposedly an angel selling wares on the street in the second Twilight Zone movie, he sat me in his lap in my mother's kitchen and held me all day. That same actor.
Hmm.
And he had Parkinson's disease, just like Michael J. Fox.
Hmm.
He died of it
Interesting.
on my whole life is like this. My whole life is murdered children thrown on my properties, kidnapped off my properties in Oakland County, Michigan. The last kid murdered was Timmy King, and that's President Ford's real name, King, and I'm the King family. His parents were Gardner and King, and I'm Gardner and I'm King. And Gardner's mother was Mrs. Baker. So even Bill Gates is my cousin.
Yeah.
And I married Joe Jacob of IBM. I married his daughter, his stepdaughter.
Yeah.
And that's when he gave Gates the software to make his first computer. At my wedding in the 60s. And I was playing his Bottomline, and I hired Weiner and Associates to protect my trademark. They went to New York and they sold it to everybody under the sun as he exposed himself to little kids online. Weiner, Clinton's friend.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's real funny. My next door neighbor, Barr, Roseanne Barr's family, and the Attorney General Barr, his father, gave Epstein his job in Manhattan as a teacher with the little kids he was selling. And a teacher back then would make $2.50, $3 an hour for half the year. They made him a billionaire buying sex from little kids, from Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah.
Clinton, the Queen's son, Trump, Musk. How does a guy making $3 an hour as a teacher in Manhattan buy an island home in the Virgin Islands and own a jet? And they all flew on it. Think about this.
Right.
And they would put me on planes and try to fly me to gay bars in California. That's what Osborne was doing to me. And this is
Wow.
Selection Committee.
Hmm.
Well, we can end this video here.
Okay.
Do you have any?
Well, no, I don't have much to add, but I mean, your story's just like none other. And
How many times have I told you this story?
oh, probably 1,000.
And you've
That's
known
pro
me,
and I don't even think that's an exaggeration.
and you know me for 7 years, right?
Yeah.
And the story never changes, does it?
No, you just keep saying the same thing over and over and over.
I'm saying the truth.
Mhm.
They murdered my uncle, Admiral Byrd, 2 presidents. And I can even prove that. I went to Coast and started talking about reptilians. And then Laura Eisenhower, whose father murdered Admiral Byrd, was stalking me and took over my story
Yeah,
all over the globe.
it's unreal.
They were stalking me my entire life.
Hmm.
And all of this is truth.
Wow.
And then Giorgio, I don't know if he knows it or not, but he's from Greece. And they started off Ancient Aliens with diaries Byrd didn't even write.
Well, I'm not sure that we talked a great deal primarily about torture, but we did discuss a lot of interesting
How can I have
topics today.
how can I have my entire family murdered 5 times? My entire family murdered 5 times. No news and no obituaries. How is that possible in America? And then
Because
Alex Jones lived with Nichols, and Nichols and McVeigh were my next door neighbors.
the people doing it run the media. That's the only conceivable
Alex
explanation.
Jones' wife was Mrs. Nichols, and the
Right.
Nichols family was married to the family, I forget the name, that shot John Lennon into Dakota. and she moved right in next door to me here on the West Coast.
I can't think of it.
I can't either. But the very family that shot John Lennon as I was Bottomline, and the Beatles were marking me. Lovely Rita is my dad's sister. And then I was running Acme Cleveland for Russ, living with Quinn. And you got I Am the Walrus, Cuckoo Cachoo, when Quinn the Eskimo gets here. And they moved, Tennessee moved the Osbourne family to the park I was living in, put them in charge of the park. The very family that murdered my twin.
Yeah.
Two weeks after I murdered there, after the Lily Lid murders, they moved the Osbourne family from Alaska to Tennessee to run the park I was staying in. It was called Kinzer Park.
Yeah.
And then Osborne, married to Metcalf, kept trying to have sex with me, and I would just rub her feet and tell her no.
Yeah.
And they owned a ministry in Alaska. Adrian Osborne and Andrea Osborne. The very family that murdered my twin and raped me in Michigan. And now they're Trump's election committee. It's very interesting. But the Tennessee Valley Authority hired them to run the park I was in. You take care. I'll send you
Okay.
I'll send you the video, put it up on YouTube like you always do.
You bet. Well, have a good night, Hugh.
You too, Greg.